Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing with Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 8, Chapter 8. Seeing Hound Dog wasn't as bad as Izuku was expecting it to be. As promised, Sensei had introduced the two of them after walking Izuku down to the counseling office. He hadn't exactly been soft as he gestured to the man with one of his bandaged arms. The one on his side Izuku wasn't standing by, with nothing more than a tired hum of Hound Dog as an introduction. He then proceeded to look towards Izuku, nodding in his direction before lolling his head back towards Hound Dog. Midoriya Izuku. The introductions could have used some work. Izuku was still nervous, but his sensei had done as promised. Thankfully, Izuku was sure that the man would get more practice as he'd been doing introductions with Hound Dog at least 18 more times, as he managed to corner and persuade his classmates like he'd done for Izuku. "Good morning, Midoriya," Hound Dog had greeted with a slight smile. "You're welcome to call me Hound Dog, or Rio-sensei if you prefer. Do you have a preference of what you'd like me to call you?" "Midoriya is fine." Izuku shrugs nervously at Sensei's side. Or Izuku, I don't mind." "Midoriya it is, then." The man gave a nod. "I've already been briefed on your newly manifested quirk by Eraserhead. We'll talk more about that amongst other things in this session, but I'd really like to just focus on getting to know you today, unless, of course, you've got an agenda for us, which is fine, too." Hound Dog flashes a grin behind his muzzle, before glancing at Aizawa-sensei. They share a brief second of eye contact, and then Hound Dog is gesturing Izuku into the room invitingly. "I'll take it from here, Eraser. Why don't you come on in, Midoriya? Have a seat wherever you'd like." Without meaning to, Izuku shoots a cautious, uncertain look to the side at his homeroom teacher, almost shrinking in on himself when he barely catches the teacher's eyes on him. They're hidden away behind the bandages, hardly seen in the slit of missing bandages to even give him his eyesight back, but Izuku catches a glimpse of them. He's not entirely sure why he'd done it, why he'd looked over for support from the man, but he had. He just knows his cheeks are slowly starting to glow with some embarrassment, so he ducks into the room in just a few seconds after realizing what he'd done. Izuku throws an awkward wave back in his teacher's direction, eyes still locked on the floor in embarrassment, so he doesn't see his sensei's face or his eyes. He doesn't see a reaction, if there even is one at all. "Thank you for walking me down, Sensei," Izuku mumbles out before turning swiftly and fully entering the room. Hound Dog lingers outside the doorway a second long, no doubt talking to Sensei, probably about him, but Izuku just pretends that they're not. He just sits stiffly on the love seat and the couch across from the armchair and waits. Since Izuku didn't have an agenda coming into the session, hadn't really wanted to come to begin with, Hound Dog leads it. He gets to know Izuku as much as the boy is willing to share. The first talk about his new quirk, Izuku tells him that there's certain basics of it, without revealing too much of the quirk. They draw up a rough draft together of what his quirk counseling will look like, and decide that Tuesdays will focus on his quirk, while Thursdays was a more general check-in. But the man still makes sure to stress that Izuku can come to him with any problems at any time, and the gesture is appreciated. He knows he won't, but it's nice to have the option. After the quirk talk, they swiftly transition into home life talk. The teen talks a bit about his family at Hound Dog's suggestion, knowing he can't be too honest or he'll have more problems to deal with. Besides, he doesn't want to bother his mother with this, so he keeps his answers clipped and to the point. He hopes he keeps his voice natural, but he's not sure how observant Hound Dog truly is. Izuku explains how his mother works long hours to provide, and how his father is in America, how he hadn't seen him in over 10 years because he hadn't gotten a quirk. He doesn't share that part, though. "But it doesn't really bother me, Hound Dog Sensei. My mom and I are doing just fine on our own." And maybe he'd stretched the truth a bit, but in the end, what does it really matter? He doesn't let them linger on the topic for long, silently afraid that he'll let something unsavory slip, instead swiftly turning the conversation onto the friends that he'd made thus far. Now them, he's happy to talk about them. He talks of Ida and Ochako, who he'd met on that first day, as well as the other classmates he'd actually talked to and considered to be his friends, like Kirishima, Kaminari, and Asui, to name a couple. He talks about his other classmates, too, because he's got nothing against them, just hasn't really gotten a chance to really meet them yet. It's Hound Dog who brings up Kachan, the one classmate Izuku hadn't mentioned. The teen has a feeling that Hound Dog knows more than he's letting on, probably from Sensei or maybe even Kachan, who'd already had a couple of sessions with Hound Dog. Izuku knows that's entirely Sensei's doing, just like Izuku's own counselor visits right now. It's nice to know that Sensei had kept his word. Hound Dog doesn't object when Izuku tiptoes around the topic of Kacchan like he had been talking about his family, and the teen's silently grateful that the pro is leaving him to slowly hazard his way through this session at his own will. They don't talk about anything Izuku doesn't want to, and it's honestly a weight off of his chest. He doesn't feel forced into anything, and the look on Hound Dog's face makes him feel comfortable to not talk about things yet, so he doesn't force himself to. Instead, Izuku offers up another topic. Oboro, his best friend outside of school. Hound Dog doesn't bat an eye at his deflection when it comes to talking about Kacchan, and Izuku just falls into the next topic of conversation. Hound Dog seems interested in Izuku's friend, though the teen refuses to give a name or any personal details about the ghost, though he doesn't honestly know much. Still, Oboro was a student here. He doesn't know when, but he knows he definitely was, and he's not sure if Hound Dog would know him, so he keeps it broad. The student speaks highly of Oboro, sharing what stories they have after just under 3 weeks of even knowing each other. He tells the pro how funny the ghost is and how well they get along, how Oboro is always coming over to his place and how he often walks home with Izuku. Well, he tells him that they meet at the train station because Oboro isn't technically a student here, and it might raise red flags if the counselor starts looking into the fact that someone who isn't a student is leaving campus with him. I'm glad to hear you have such a close friend, Midoriya. The pro gives a light smile, and when Izuku finishes rambling about the ghost, the teen gives an enthusiastic nod, grinning widely as he thinks of his friend. They talk a little bit of the USJ incident, too, and it's the one topic Hound Dog doesn't seem to budge on. Up until that point, he hadn't made Izuku and him talk about anything in particular, but he let Izuku skirt around things he didn't want to talk about yet. Still, the counselor isn't willing to let Izuku brush the USJ off. Again, he doesn't force anything, but he does keep returning to it when Izuku trails off. It's not that he doesn't want to talk about it. He does. He's just not sure how to talk about it without really talking about it. He and his ghost friend had touched, and together they'd used Izuku's new, oldest quirk in order to use Oboro's own cloud quirk in the real world, which was very, very impossible. There is one thing Izuku doesn't mind talking about, though. I thought he was going to die. That thing, the monster, it didn't let up on him, and we saw it hurting him, but we couldn't. There wasn't anything we could do. He told us to leave before, but it felt wrong. You students did the right thing staying back, Hound Dog tells him softly. There wasn't a lot anyone could have done. Aizawa did what he had to do to ensure you and your classmates' safety. We all would have done the same thing had we been in his shoes. He doesn't regret it, Midoriya. We'd all gone the extra mile if we needed to, if it meant keeping you students safe. I'm sure Aizawa would do it all over again in a heartbeat if it meant keeping you safe as well. Does he really like us that much? Izuku's nose scrunches up. He's never seemed overly fond of them, glaring up from the front of the room and calling them idiots, lecturing them and being generally done with them before class has even really started. Izuku knows he'd seen Sensei putting his life on the line for them. He'd watched just out of sight as it happened, but he's still the same man who threatened to expel him on the first day of class. He'd been planning on actually expelling him, too, if what Oboro had said was true. Aizawa is a kind man, Hound Dog explained softly, after a second thought. He's rough around the edges, a bit blunt at times, and a little harsh, but he's a good teacher. He's a good man and a good hero. He'll do everything in his power to help you lot thrive in his class, and even if that means working you to the bone. He cares, just in his own way. I won't put words into his mouth and say that he likes you guys, but I will say that he doesn't dislike his class. There's another pause, hardly a second before Hound Dog shakes his head with a nervous laugh. You didn't hear any of that from me, though. He likes his reputation of being a heartless and unrelenting man, and he's pretty scary still, even if he's got a heart. This stays between us, yeah? Izuku can't help the laugh that bubbles out from his lungs as he nods. I cannot believe him. Izuku has to keep his eyes locked down on the paper before him. It's getting harder and harder not to look up. Stupid idiot. Gets his face pounded into the ground, wakes up from a stupid 2-day coma, and comes into school the next frickin' day. Oboro was quite obviously annoyed, having not budged from the position that he'd been in when Izuku had arrived that morning after his counseling session. I mean, substitutes exist for a reason. The ghost's arms had been crossed tautly across his chest, with his arms and hands pinned in his armpits. His face had been curled into a scowl that must resemble Aizawa-sensei's own. It's a surprising look on Oboro's face, considering that Izuku's used to seeing wide smiles and teasing smirks. He knows Oboro's annoyance hadn't subsided at all as class had started. "All right," President Mike's voice calls in Izuku's attention. "Compound words, yo. You take two words, put them together, and you get a new word with a new meaning. There are 3 different kinds of compound words, you dig? The first is a closed compound word. These words are written as a single word, like a haircut in newspaper. The second is an open compound word. These are written as separate words, like high school, living room. And the last is hyphenated compounds. These are words that use a hyphen in between, like well-known and second-rate." President Mike pauses, and the only sound to be heard is the students scribbling what he's said down, and Oboro snarling softly in annoyance that only Izuku can hear. It'll no doubt be on the exam in the year. "All right, listeners, I've written 2 words on the board. Anyone want to take a shot at making it a compound word?" Izuku's gaze settled on the board where 2 words, up and make, had been written there. He cocks his head at them, putting the 2 words first as up make, in the order they'd been written, before shaking his head and trying makeup. No one raises their hands, but Mike-sensei didn't seem deterred. He just smiles lightly. "No prob, listeners. I'll tell you what. Let's take a closer look at those 2 words first before we start pushing them together, you dig? Up. Who knows what that means?" This time a couple of hands raised. "Kaminari," Mike-sensei calls on him. Up, like up in the sky, looking up." The blonde-haired boy furrowed his brow and looked up for a second before pointing upward toward the ceiling uncertainly. It prompts some giggles from the class, but Mike-sensei looked pleased. "Yep," he praised. "Righto, up like in the sky. The direction, good job. Now, what about make? Any guesses?" "I mean, seriously, 1 day off won't kill him. For a guy who likes to sleep to the point that he carries around a stupid sleeping bag and will sleep wherever he can, why the hell does he avoid actual rest so much? Why make such a big fuss out of it?" Izuku can't help but let his attention drift back towards Oboro. He is sat at Mike-sensei's desk, feet kicked up on the desktop, leaning back, with the same scowl from earlier sketched on his face. He's not looking at Izuku, instead looking at Mike-sensei, who's still up at the front of the chalkboard teaching them. "Bakugo," Mike-sensei calls out, and Izuku forces his attention back to the board. "Make something," Kachan huffed, holding his own hand up where his quirk fizzled through his palm. "I make explosions. That extra," Kachan gestures vaguely in Yaoyorozu's direction, "makes a bunch of different shit. Creating something." "Correct, but please watch your language in class, you dig?" "Yeah, whatever." Kachan huffs, and it's about as scolded as Izuku's sure the teen has ever sounded. There's hardly any fight in his voice. Mike flashes him a smile, pleased with the response, even if it's not the kind that he's used to getting when reprimanding students. They all know that's about as nice as Kachan gets, so he'll take it as it is. "So we know that up means something above, something overhead that you need to look up at, and make means something that you create with other things. Now, anyone want to try the compound word made with the 2 of them?" "I can't believe no one stopped him. I mean, come on, Zashi, you saw him. The guy looks like death incarnate. Someone should have told him that he couldn't come in. He's scary, but he's not that scary. Grow some balls and tell him, no, I'm going to go home. Take his UA card, so he can't come in. This'll be showed a free zone until he's had at least 1 day of rest. Why am I the only one concerned here?" "Makeup." Jiro's voice drags Izuku from his thoughts. He shoots his attention away from where Oboro is still mumbling angrily to the teacher, who doesn't even know that he's there. "Right," Mike grins from the board, turning swiftly to write the compound word beneath the 2 separated words. When he's done, he turns back to the class. "Anyone want to take a stab at what it means?" "I can't believe Nezu let him come in looking like that. I mean, he looks like he walked out of an Egyptian tomb. He's more bandaged than man. Nezu should have—" A pause as Oboro's face pinches in thought. "Wait a second, that stupid rat probably made him come in." And Izuku chokes on a snort of laughter that he's tried to contain. He just called the principal a stupid rat. "Sorry," Izuku yelps, hands coming up to cover his mouth as embarrassment floods his face. "Shit, I'm sorry, Izu. I forgot you could, hear me." Oboro looks apologetic, leaning towards the student with a frown. Izuku wants to wave him off. It was an honest mistake after all, but he really can't with everyone's attention suddenly on him. "Sorry, Mike-sensei, I didn't mean to laugh out loud, the ghost that just called our school principal a stupid rat. No, not a good excuse. That one's just as believable as the dog ate my homework." "Don't worry about it, little listener." Mike tilts his head softly. "While you're talking, though, any idea on what our compound word means?" Izuku lets his eyes flick from present Mike to the board, then back to his teacher. He bites his lip. Makeup, like to make something up, like, for example, a makeup test. I missed our test, so I came in after school for a makeup. Almost, listener. Mike gives him a light smile. Though you are right, that is the proper use of makeup, with a hyphen, which is a compound word. The compound word we're looking at right now is makeup without a space or a hyphen. You've got your compound types a bit mixed up, but you're skipping ahead of us, listener. Want to try again? Izuku shakes his head to the point that his bangs fall over his eyes. Present Mike doesn't seem bothered, just turns back towards the class with a loud prompt of, anyone else want to take a shot at it? What about makeup, like what you put on your face? Kirishima suggests with a shrug. The lipstick and the powder stuff, that black eye pencil? Yes, Mike cheers. Perfect. And what kind of compound is that? There's a dull murmur as everyone answers all at once. A few people are wrong, but the majority respond with closed compound. Yes, 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 Mike grins. And what kind of compound was Midoriya's example? Hyphenated. There's more caution in that sound of guesses, and the whole class does not answer, but enough of them do that Mike's happy. Perfect. He turns back to the board, not to write out both Izuku's and Kirishima's examples, followed by the type of compound that they are. You little listeners are so smart. I'm so proud. Now we've covered 2 of 3 compound types. Anyone want to try the last one? It's Yaoyorozu who raises her hand, but instead of calling on her, Mike-sensei just points enthusiastically in her direction. Make up, like, do you want chamomile tea or Earl Grey? Make up your mind. It's an open compound. Right you are, Mike laughs, turning to add Yaoyorozu's addition to the board. Now you have basic understanding, yo. I've been giving you guys a handout for you kiddos to work on for the next rest of the class. It'll be homework if you don't finish it. Due at the start of class tomorrow. Let me know if you need any help. Now, class rep, duty rep, hand these out, yeah? Ida and Yaoyorozu stand to collect the papers from the podium to pass out, while Mike-sensei makes his way to his desk. Oboro lets out a yelp, just barely managing to get out of the chair before Mike-sensei sits on him. Izuku keeps that snort of laughter to himself as he quietly thanks Ida, who'd set a paper on his desk. Oboro stalks toward Izuku with a frown, pulling himself up to sit on his desk. I'm sorry again, Izu. I think I have a ranting problem, but usually no one cares because no one ever hears me. I'm just so upset. I mean, why is he even back? Can no one talk that idiot into some self-care? Don't worry about it, Izuku hums softly, hoping his words are hidden away by the scratches of his pencil. I'm surprised he's back too, but he seems all right. I mean, not physically yet, of course, but, mentally. That stubborn asshole, Oboro huffs. Anyways, need any help with that? No, Izuku shoots him a sheepish sort of glare instead. Worth a shot, Oboro grins as he leans back. His palms press into the back edge of Izuku's desk as he kicks his feet up onto the back of Izuku's chair. The student just lets out a light huff of annoyance, though it was through his nose as the ghost shoots him a playful grin. Just hold your hand out, Izuku prompts with a sigh. His own hand is held out too, hand raised like he's expecting a high five. His palm is facing Oboro, who's glaring down at his own hand. They'd been trying to touch again since the school had ended. It's not a skill if we both have to be emotional messes for it to work, Izuku had huffed out as he unlocked the apartment door. I can't rely on being overcome by emotions to use this. You can't either. That's how people get hurt. I need to be able to conjure this quirk, without having my judgment clouded by emotions. But we've only used it when we're emotional, Oboro reminds as he plops down on the couch. I could only do it when I was scared, back at the USJ, and again in your room when I was thinking of the USJ. Both times I barely even know what was happening. I know, Izuku hums, but we do know what's happening now, and that's what practice is for. We have to try to expand on this. Right now it's emotion-related, or so we believe, but if we practice, if we get to know it, and we use it when we're not desperate, I don't know, maybe we'll be able to broaden the limitations. Do you think that'll really work? Oboro quirks an eyebrow. I mean, I'd love to be able to use my quirk without feeling like I'm dying all over again due to panic and desperation. Izuku ignores the twinge of regret for his friend as he nods slowly. It's worth a shot. And that's how they ended up here, sitting facing each other on the couch in the living room. They've tried 4 times thus far to touch, and each time Oboro's hand had slipped right through Izuku's. They're starting easy, with hands, well, fingers really, but they'll take whatever they can get. The theory behind it was that if they're both trying, using the same body part, palms, then maybe they could make it work. They hadn't had much success when randomly touching, like at school, but when Obero's finger had phased through him, Izuku's head was attempted to flick his forehead, or when Izuku had accidentally elbowed through Obero when he'd been working on his math homework at lunch. Why am I getting the feeling that this isn't going to work? Obero frowned, hand hovering just an inch or so away from Izuku's, hand in the same open palm position. 5th time's the charm. Izuku lifted his shoulder in a half-hearted shrug. I thought the 3rd and 4th times were the charm. Obero snarked back, but there wasn't any heat behind it, just defeat. Izuku shot the ghost a look of annoyance. Obero rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy sigh before extending his arm and the rest of the way so his palm lined up with Izuku's. He hesitated just half a second before finally going the last bit of distance, where his hand went through Izuku's. See, Obero frowned. We're definitely missing something. I don't know what, Izuku shook his head, his frown heavy with both defeat and annoyance. You've had your quirk training and counseling. What are we missing? That was years ago, Obero squawked. Yeah, well, Izuku snorted a laugh. You're better off knowing than I am. I didn't have either. What do you remember? Right, the ghost sucks in a breath, puckering his lips as he tries to think back on those first couple quirk counseling sessions that he'd had when his quirk first manifested. A cheerful little 4-year-old Obero with a small, fluttery cloud trailing after him like a pet on a leash. That was a good 26 years ago at this point. To be honest, most of us had the problem of using our quirk right off the bat. The counseling was to help us control it, not to help access it. Well, I mean, we did that too, but the first major milestone was being able to cap your quirk. We're all just so excited, and it's like second nature to use it. They teach us to keep it contained, to not have control over it, or to have control when not to use it. I don't know what to do when the quirk won't work. It's the opposite. Second nature, this seems to be the part Izuku singled out. He hums the word thoughtfully to himself, thumb catching under his chin, while his pointer finger rubs along the dip of his chin thoughtfully. Then he's muttering. Obero has gotten used to this since befriending the teen, but it still makes him snicker every time he sees it happen. How does someone get so far into their own head that they lose sight of literally everything? It was better to just let Izuku run his brain instead of interrupting him, especially when he was so focused on their current problem. My quirk already is second nature, Izuku finally blinks out of the trance. It's always been there. I've always seen you guys. I've spent most of my life ignoring this. My quirk, since it's not, well, generally acceptable. I've never stopped seeing ghosts. Knew I never would, but maybe all this time I've been capping the true potential. I didn't want something else that would make me different, so I walled it off. You've been capping it all this time? Obero worried his bottom lip between his teeth. So how do you use it at the USJ? And this is just a guess, I don't think I was in the right state of mind to just keep up. Izuku shook his head. I mean, I did almost die, and Sensei was badly injured, and that villain was going for Asui and Minoru. I think that the second that wall crumbled, you had access to the quirk, and a part of you, subconscious or instinctual, I don't know, something in you, took the opportunity to use my quirk to your advantage. If that's the case, it's a good thing that you kept it capped. Obero's eyes widened in horror. I don't know how I did it. I was moving before I knew what was happening, but I had full control of my quirk, and it was more powerful than it's ever been. What if it had been a villain to harness the power of your quirk instead of me? Izuku bites his lip. The thought had crossed his mind just seconds ago as well. If it opened a link to Obero, who's to say it didn't open a link to any of the ghosts milling around? He hadn't seen any, but then again, he can hardly differentiate living people from dead people. Any of those villains could have been a ghost. He's quick to relax his jaw when he faintly tastes some metal on his tongue. I don't think that would happen, he offers slowly, frowning thoughtfully as his gaze lulls towards Obero. I can't be sure, of course, but I've been emotional around ghosts before, and nothing's ever used my quirk. I think I have some control over it. I just didn't know it. So how'd I use it then? Izuku wrinkles his nose. I trust you, dummy. I think there was a level of consent that neither of us noticed, like subconsciously. You reacted before you knew what you were doing, and I didn't know what was happening until after the fact. So maybe that's how you were able to access my quirk. That kind of makes sense, I guess. Obero cocks his head to the side as he attempts to understand, before his mouth drops open and he blows out a small little exhale of, oh, followed by an enthusiastically fond, I trust you too, Zuko. The shorter of the two shakes his head with a roll of his eyes. Now I just have to figure out how I managed to open the connection. If I'm right, my quirk is always restricted subconsciously, but how do I open it when I want and need to? Well, Oboro sucked in his teeth. Why'd you need it in the first place? Izuku's mind instantly settles on Mom. He decided when he was little that he wasn't going to burden anyone else with his power. She hadn't liked it. It scared her. It's what had drove a wedge between his parents' marriage first, and then drove another between him and his father, before finishing off with a third between him and his mother. The quirkless thing had played a part in it too, but they all knew exactly what had destroyed their bonds. Things that people didn't understand scared them. He'd scared them. So he stopped bringing it up, stopped talking about it and acknowledging it when he wasn't inclined to. Izuku thinks that's when he really built up the wall, cornering the piece of himself that people didn't like, that he'd been taught to be scared of. I don't know, he whispers out despite his thoughts. Despite the way the lie rolls off his tongue, Izuku's lost in his own thoughts. If that's when he started bottling the parts of his quirk that weren't constant up, that's when he needed to put himself open. Let's try again. I want to try something. Are you okay? When Izuku looks towards his friend, Oboro's eyes are furrowed in concern, and his lips are curled in a light frown. He's studying Izuku, and the green-haired teen isn't sure what Oboro sees in his expression that would make him look like that. Course, Izuku forces a laugh that wavers towards the end. He clears his throat, swallowing down the wince before holding his hand out. You said you trust me, right? So trust me. Oboro eyes him for just a second before blowing out a breath and reaching his hand out. It stalls right in front of Izuku's, and it takes a few long seconds for Izuku to realize the ghost is giving him all his faith, which includes being the one closing the distance between their hands. Izuku digs deep into himself. As he heaves a breath, he struggles to locate that childhood fear that had been instilled in his head by his mother and father. Conversations in passing that he shouldn't have heard, and things that were said in the heat of the moment. Supposedly innocent things that had struck right through Izuku's heart, things he held on to, tools he used to lock away what no one liked about him. Normal children don't see ghosts, Inko. It's a phase, he'll grow out of it. Maybe don't talk about your imaginary friends, all right, sweetheart? You know how people talk. They're not real, Izuku. You need to let go of this now. I'm so tired of this. Grow up. It's weird. He's weird. He'll never be a normal child, Inko. Now the brat doesn't even have a quirk either. He's a lost cause. Izuku squeezes his eyes shut. You're okay. You're okay. This is okay. They're okay. There's nothing wrong with you. Don't be afraid. You're all right. Let it go. It's okay. He's not sure when he closes the gap between their hands. He hadn't registered moving, but he feels Oboro's hand against his suddenly, flat against his palm, pressing back as hard as Izuku is. He feels it. It worked. He'd really accessed it. The green-haired teen forces his eyes open, letting out a surprised breath that he hadn't known he'd been holding in. Oboro is staring down at their hands in awe, fingers trembling as they lift cautiously from Izuku's fingers, only to press back like he's trying to tap them. You did it. Oboro's voice is watery. Wow. Izuku, you're incredible. Make a cloud. Izuku doesn't tear his gaze away from his fingers. In fact, he drops his fingers into the gap between Oboro's own fingers just to make sure they don't jump apart like they had at the USJ. They'd worked too hard for it all to be lost by nothing more than a slight shift that could separate their hands. Oboro follows suit, fingers slowly dropping over Izuku's, and it's only then that Izuku lifts his gaze from their hands. When Oboro looks up at his friend's face, all he can do is follow his gaze upwards. There, settled just below the ceiling in Izuku's apartment, is a small, fluffy white cloud. It worked. Yeah, Izu. Oboro laughs softly, staring up at his cloud before looking back at the teen with a wide, toothy grin. It totally did. Look around you, Aizawa-sensei's monotone voice directed. Izuku did as told, blinking around them at the gym that they'd arrived in. He hadn't known what he'd be expecting for their first private lesson, but it certainly wasn't this. The room was large and spacious, but filling it was dozens of pillars of what looked like concrete. They stood tall, some thicker than others, but all sturdy and well constructed. This is Gym Gamma. Sensei told him sharply. I asked Cementos to build this training ground for you. I don't know what you're capable of right now. Your quirk is new and powerful, and frankly not something I'm comfortable having you test your full potential around you or your peers just yet. There are too many unknowns about it, and it's just not a risk that I'm willing to take quite yet when neither of us knows what you're capable of. Izuku swallows thickly, nodding slowly. His gaze flickers over the pillars once more, frowning in thought. There's only one goal for you today. You're going to use your quirk to destroy each and every one of these pillars. You're free to do it however you see fit. Destroy them, knock them down, crumble them. Go plus ultra, whatever gets the job done. Aizawa Sensei's gaze scans up Izuku calculatingly before he's looking back over the course. You have half an hour, which is generous, to knock them all over. Anything goes. Now, should you fail to complete the task in the allotted time, you'll be doing 20 suicide drills at the start of our Sunday training session. Izuku narrowed his eyes at his teacher in surprise, eyebrows furrowing. He could do whatever he wanted to destroy them. Anything. He knows about One for All, is completely capable of doing so. If he could take out multiple floors in the battle simulations, then it could certainly. However, Sensei drawls, and Izuku's attention whips back to him. There's a catch. I don't want to see any major injuries. No broken arms, no broken legs. We're done as soon as I deem you injured. In addition, that'd be an automatic disqualification since you won't be finishing. Izuku's mouth opened to refute that, because he'd hardly been able to use his quirk without some kind of injury. But his teacher holds out a silencing hand before he can. I know. Though I'd love to see you come out of this unscathed, I know you're unable to use your quirk without taking damage as of now. So in consideration to that, I'll overlook broken fingers. Izuku knows he's gaping. Sensei is giving him permission to... Sensei paused in his words, eyeing Izuku sharply through the gap in his bandages, almost as if reading his mind. Obviously, don't injure yourself if you can help it, but I'm well away setting a restriction that will give you a disadvantage of your quirk. That would be illogical. Use it how you know how. Today is about gauging your potential, seeing what you can do, your strengths, your weaknesses, and limitations. Izuku nods slowly, blinking at his teacher owlishly. He can almost see the annoyed scowl that he's sure is on his sensei's face as the man continues with a distraught sigh. I've seen you perform with broken fingers. As much as I hate the thought, it's only fair to let you do this exercise as you've been doing so far. You get 5 fingers to do with as you please. Hit 6 and you're done. There's another pause that drags on far too long, in Izuku's opinion, before his teacher is speaking again. The bottom line is, you get half an hour to destroy each and every concrete pillar in this gym. I can and will stop the training should I deem it necessary. This training session will end if you break an arm, a leg, or break more than 5 fingers. Major injuries and an automatic disqualification, and you'll be doing suicide drills as a consequence for it. Just like if you fail to complete the task. Ready? Damn. Oboro lets out a low whistle. Good luck, Izu. Izuku glances briefly at his ghost friend, who's sitting against the wall by the door. I promise I won't get in your way. I'll just be cheering you on. Izuku frowns at him before looking back at his teacher. Yes, Sensei. Good, the man hums out gruffly. I'll be watching. Your time starts now. Problem child, go. Izuku heaved a breath before launching himself out towards the center of the gym. He feels One for All coursing through his veins as he leaps against pillars speedily to get a layout of the gym. There's about 50 pillars, all spread across the expanse of the huge training gym. They're too spread out for Izuku to rely on a smash to complete the exercise. Not that he could, since smash would render him useless, injured, which was an automatic disqualification. It didn't matter if the smash knocked them all down in one hit. He'd still fail if he hurt himself. Izuku lands on one of the centermost pillars, surveying over his surroundings. He sees both Sensei and Oboro just as he'd left them. Can almost feel Sensei's gaze burning into his back. It's different having his teacher's attention solely on him. Usually his gaze is nothing more than a glance before carrying on to study his classmates. He tries not to feel nervous under Sensei's observations. Izuku's first course of action is to use his flick attack. It had worked well during the USJ attack, and he knew it was powerful enough to do some damage here, but he also knew it would hardly do half as much damage as it had. Concrete didn't work like water. Water was easily manipulated, whereas concrete could absorb the force. Sure, it would crumble, but unlike water, the more concrete his attack passes through, the less effective it gets for residing or distant pillars. Still, it's his best attack, and the one he's sure will do the most damage to the course considering his guidelines. Izuku launches off the pillar that he'd been standing on, aiming his flick like he's looking through a rifle scope. He aims for one towards the center, close but far enough away that he won't get caught in the rubble. The teen supports his wrist with his non-dominant hand for ensuring that he doesn't accidentally break his wrist before finally flicking it. When he'd done it back at the USJ, the added support of his second hand had made for a stiff pain in his wrist instead of a solid break, so he hopes it holds up again. The power courses over the pillars as it's released from this finger. They rumble as they fall, crumbling down to nothing. Dust collects as Izuku lands gracefully, just out of reach of the settling debris. The pillars toward the back furthest away are cracked and breaking apart in chunks, unlike the ones that were hit first, which are nothing more than rubble. He can faintly see the cement wall of the gym cracked, but still intact. It was nothing more than surface-level damage. His pointer finger aches, and his thumb isn't much better. The bruising is already an irritated purple color. It hurts, but all he can do is squeeze his wrist in an attempt to numb the pain and keep going. The pain of broken fingers is almost familiar at this point, as sad as that sounds. Izuku is pleased after his second survey of the fallen pillars. His attack had knocked out a decent quarter of them, but it also took 2 of Izuku's limited 5 fingers. It was a good strategy, a good start, but he couldn't do it again. He can't aim without his thumb, and now that he has the damage, he's not sure he wants to bust any more of his fingers. He needs to think of an alternative. Izuku wonders if that is what his sensei had planned with the activity. He wouldn't put it past the man. It was clever, really, teaching Izuku in a way that he almost has to teach himself. Sensei had offered nothing more than guidelines and rules, a motivating punishment for him. It's almost like a game. A game Izuku desperately doesn't want to fail. He needs to adapt if he wants to avoid suicide sprints. They were hell, and, well, there's a small part of him that wants to finish Sensei's game for no means other than to impress his standoffish teacher. Sensei sees potential in him, one of the few adults in his life to do so. So he's going to make damn sure that he lives up to the man's expectations. Izuku climbs back on one of the center pillars, squeezing his injured fingers into a fist as he rubs at his wrist. The adrenaline of using his quirk has almost entirely canceled out the pain, but he knows it's there. He honestly is not sure what to do next. The flick had been his big move, or his biggest move he could do without being disqualified. The teen relaxes his fingers, fanning out over them to glance over the damage. That had been 100% of One for All. Using 100% would not get him out of this. He couldn't just give one good hit and have it all be done with like the 0-pointer, and what he'd attempted to do with the Nomu. Maybe he needs to use some of his quirk. Some of it. What had All Might meant when they talked on the beach? The egg in the microwave. He needs to cook the egg, but not explode it. He'd been trying to use 5% of One for All, and it still hurt, but it didn't completely harm him like using full cowling. It was close, and he's sure that if he used it excessively, he'd end up hurt and Sensei would call this off, but what if he used just 1%? Just enough power so he's not a 15-year-old scrawny kid punching the cement pillar. The question is, would 1% be enough? He could just as easily break his knuckles on the cement, an ordinary teen. He'd never been one to punch things prior to his quirk, but he'd seen people fracture their hands punching walls and faces. Quirk's nowhere to be seen. However, it could go either way. He could either find a compromise or take himself out of the running without ever using One for All. But he knows he just can't stand around, not when Sensei is studying him from afar, no doubt nitpicking everything he's done. He's too far for Izuku to make out his expression, especially with the bandages covering his features, but he'd felt his teacher's stern glance on him this whole time. Izuku looks out at the sea of cement, shaking himself from his thoughts as he looks down at the pillars he stood on. He spreads his feet, clenching his hand into a fist where he activates his quirk. It's hard to just harness 1% of something that could be so powerful, but he thinks he manages. He blows out a breath, blinks his eyes shut for just a second before focusing his eyes open to glare down at the pillar. He narrows his eyes before dropping a punch to the top of the pillar. Pain blooms in his knuckles, but it's definitely not a break. It's impact irritation. He's quick to flex his fingers again before wobbling and jumping to the side of the crumbling pillar. It worked. The pillar isn't as destroyed as the ones from Flick and Attack, but it's slowly crumbling, and he's not hurt. Izuku doesn't have much time to be happy he'd managed to use some of his quirk without harming himself, because time is ticking down still. A half an hour really isn't that long when you think about it. He makes quick work of running through the gym, punching the bases of the pillars. The air is more concrete dust than anything, and he's been tripping over destroyed pieces of pillar as he moves, but he'd been steadily making progress. Not nearly as fast as he'd liked as with Flick, but progress was progress. He made it through a good half of what was left before he felt the pain of his knuckles pulsing through the adrenaline. They weren't broken still, but they were bleeding. He'd broken the skin, and he knows that a couple more hits will break them. This is his body warning him, stop before you get stopped. He forces in a ragged breath, wiping the blood coating his knuckles into the palm of his gym uniform. He's so glad that he has a spare in his locker, because he's not sure what his friends would think if he showed up in bloody clothes. Midoriya, Sensei calls from the door. He hadn't moved still, but Izuku could see him. Status? Nothing's broken. Izuku winced at the way his voice rose higher. Just some blood, but I'm okay. There is a lingering of contemplative silence. Izuku fears that Sensei will deem him injured, and he'll have to accept defeat, but his Sensei really does like surprising him, doesn't he? You have 10 minutes left. Oboro cheers from behind Sensei's stiff form. You got this. Come on, Izuku. Stick it to the man. Show him what you can do. It's a very good thing that Sensei can't see Izuku rolling his eyes at Oboro's antics. He'd hate to have to explain why he was rolling eyes when it was technically just the two of them in the gym. He'd die if Sensei thought he was rolling eyes at him. Izuku forces his thoughts back on the task. He can't use his hands anymore in fear that they'll break. He could, of course, try using his non-dominant hand, which is currently damage-free, but that's iffy. If he moves wrong, it could be all over. He's not ambidextrous, but he knows that he could use his opposite hand in a pinch. This isn't a pinch. It's not worth the risk of breaking his arm because he's unused to fighting with it. He should stick to what he knows, what he's seen. His fists, like he's watched All Might do for years. Like he'd stumbled his way through, like a fawn learning to stand. He fights with his fists, but he can't. He can't risk putting any more pressure onto his dominant hand either. So what does that leave? His feet. He'd never really thought of using his feet in the heat of training or battles. All Might had always used fists. Punching was easy. Kicking was less so. He didn't have a spectacular balance, and he'd never tried to direct One for All down. But he should. His feet were unarmed right now, and he could kick well enough. Plus, it was his only option. Use his feet or face defeat. So he does. He's not agile, nothing like Aizawa-sensei. He'd seen the man glide gracefully through the air, taking out villains and landing with perfect ease. It was beyond impressive. Maybe he can practice some hand-to-hand combat with the man during another session, or start studying some kind of martial arts. Izuku launches into a wobbly kick. He forces One for All through his body and down to his feet. One for All is tipping between 1% and 2%, and he just prays this turns out like he wants instead of breaking his foot. He feels his foot make contact with the pillar. He feels the burst of his quirk, and it shoots through his foot as it consumes the pillar. He doesn't hear a crack of bone snapping or that blossoming pain. It's crumbling when he forces his attention, and he puts it from his unseemingly unharmed foot. It's crumbling and falling, and it worked. He'd used his foot. He could kick with One for All. Cheers were filling the room, but Izuku instantly knows it's not his sensei. Izuku glances back at the cheering when he sees Oboro stood straight up. He's got that squinty-eyed grin on his face, arms stretched over his head. His arms bend over his shoulders, and his fists are hidden behind his head. You're doing amazing, sweetie. Izuku regrets ever letting Oboro watch old meme compilations. He huffs out a laugh before getting back to his task. He's almost done. The pillar numbers are slowly dwindling down. He makes quick work of kicking the base of the pillars. Each pillar cracks at his impact and slowly caves over. He's really doing it. By the time he hears the last pillar is standing and he kicks it, the one in the center that he'd used as a vantage point. He's tired at this point. One for All flickers before he manages to power it down. The exhaustion from training hits him like a bus. He's sore. His fingers ache as the adrenaline of finishing the task wears off, and his knuckles throb. His hand is covered in dried blood, but he doesn't care because he'd done it. He'd played Sensei's game, and he'd won. He takes another second to assess himself before he can kneel and palm at his foot. The top of it aches from smacking into concrete, but besides that, and his hand and fingers, he's uninjured. You managed it. Izuku jumps in surprise at the voice, attention shooting up to where Sensei is standing over his shoulder, assessing him for injuries. His gaze lingers on the broken fingers and the knuckle wounds before his eyes drop to where Izuku's still pressing against the top of his shoe to alleviate the impact pains. Anything broken? 2 fingers, Izuku tells him proudly. And wait, is that a flicker of a smile behind Sensei's bandages? It's gone so fast he thinks it was just his brain playing tricks on him. Everything else is just impact irritation. Show me. Sensei hums out, though Izuku can't help but think he almost looks impressed. He does, fanning his fingers out so his teacher can actually assess his injuries. Sensei's eyes trail up his arms, lingering on old scars and injuries that he'd gotten from junior high, as well as trying to learn one for all by himself. And your foot? Izuku blinks before taking his shoe off and sock. The top of his foot is bruised like you wouldn't believe, but he wiggles his toes and rotates his ankle before bending to his foot to prove it's not actually broken. Sensei seems content with it, giving a faint nod. So, did you learn anything? I can kick, Izuku chirps, and he slips his sock and shoe back on before standing up. I'd never thought about it before, but it worked really well. It still hurts, but I think I just need a support item like steel-toed shoes or something else padded, and then I'd be able to alternate between my fists and my feet. You did well, problem child. You exceeded my expectations, Sensei tells them as they walk back towards the door side by side. Oboro, still grinning like an idiot, stood by the door. You made good progress today, far better than I've seen you make in class. You were able to alter your strategy as the activity progressed. It's promising. Are you still afraid? Yes, Izuku answers honestly, because he is. It's powerful, and he's just now learning the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to this quirk. But I'm getting more confident with it, Sensei. So thank you. Don't thank me, the teacher huffs out. We'll keep working until you feel confident in your quirk enough. It's a logical fear to have given how late your quirk manifested and how little support practice you have, but it's not going to help you. Don't let the fear control you. Don't let fear control you. Izuku sucks in a breath as he thinks back to the evening prior. He'd realized that yesterday, when he'd sat facing his ghost friend. He'd forced himself to relax, taking shots in the dark at how to open up a conversation and a connection that he hadn't known he was pushing down. He'd realized it yesterday on his own, but it was different hearing it from his sensei. It was different coming from someone else, someone he was slowly starting to trust. It sounded like good advice now, instead of a desperate attempt to make something happen. Don't let fear control me, Izuku repeated under his breath. All right. He knows his sensei hears him mutter to himself by how he shifts slightly as he walks, but he doesn't mention it. They arrive at the door, pausing as Izuku grabs his school bag and hesitates, while his ghost friend falls into deep step behind him. A wide smirk on the ghost's lips. A smirk he desperately wants to question. Instead, Izuku looks on at the mess of fallen concrete. He silently feels bad for making a mess, but Sensei doesn't seem fazed at all. I did it. It just hits him now as he looks out. He'd done it. He'd finished Sensei's game. They were all knocked over, some crumbled to bits, and others laying in chunks. Nothing is left standing but him. You did it. Sensei gives a nod that could almost be pride. Congratulations, problem child. You managed to knock all the pillars down without taking substantial damage to your body in just over 32 minutes. Yes, he'd done it. No damage taken, or no more allowed at least. No pillar left standing, and he'd done it all in just over 32 minutes? Izuku sputters. I failed? Oboro is chuckling behind him, bent in half as he laughs. He has half a mind to swing around and backhand him. Would he be able to channel his quirk through irritation? Would that be a strong enough emotion to let loose at the USJ? Izuku thinks he hears Sensei muffle a chuckle into the bandages covering his face, and his capture scarf too, but he's not completely sure through his defeated misery. He failed. Cheer up, problem child. His teacher hums out, tone almost teasing. It's only 20 suicide sprints. Izuku just groans as the ghost at his side starts cackling. Now off you go, recovery girl's expecting you. Don't expect her to fix you up completely, just the broken fingers, got it? No more relying on the old lady just to heal every self-inflicted injury. Yes, Sensei. Izuku sighs, looking up at his teacher with a light smile. This concludes Chapter 8 of Yuuei Survival Guide. Next chapter will be up soon for you guys as well, and as always, thank you so much for listening.